On the 10th of April, 1973, a British charter airliner, carrying the mothers, sisters, and neighbors of a string of Somerset villages, flew into a blinding snowstorm on approach to Basel, Switzerland. For the better part of 20 minutes, the aircraft wandered through a series of vast, confused loops, while its pilots calmly reported that they were established on final approach, and a controller, watching an unidentified blip crawl away from his airport and toward the mountains, tried to work out who on earth it could be. At 13 minutes past 9, the blip stopped moving. 108 people died on a snowbound ridge that morning, in what remains the deadliest air disaster ever to occur on Swiss soil, and the story of how a modern airliner came to be 10 miles from the runway, flying in the wrong direction, while both of its pilots believed they were seconds from landing, is stranger than almost anyone imagined. This is the crash of Invicta International Airways Flight 435. On the 10th of April 1973, a Vickers Vanguard operated by the British charter carrier Invicta International Airlines, often styled Invicta International Airways, attempted twice to land at Basel Airport in a heavy spring snowstorm, and twice failed. On the second attempt, the crew flew what they believed was a stable approach down the electronic glide path to runway 16. In reality, they were nowhere near it. Their entire approach had unfolded south of the airport, over rising ground guided by radio beacons they had misidentified, and needles that swung to signals no chart could explain. At 9:13 that morning, the Vanguard clipped the treetops of a snow-covered ridge in the Jura foothills near the hamlet of Herrenmatt, 16 kilometers from the runway, tumbled through the forest, and broke apart. Of the 145 people on board, 108 died, most of them women from the villages of the Somerset countryside, out together on a one-day shopping trip. 55 children lost their mothers before lunchtime. The Swiss investigation that followed unspooled a chain of failures so improbable that some refused to believe it. Navigation beacons that did not meet international standards, a snowstorm that filled the radio spectrum with static, a control tower that never looked at its own radar until it was too late, minima quietly slipping below legal limits without anyone telling the crew, and, at the center of it all, a captain whose file contained one of the most extraordinary training records ever assembled by a licensed airline pilot. This is the story of how all of those failures found each other in the space of 20 minutes, on a hillside above Basel, on a morning when it should never have snowed at all. To understand what was lost on that hillside, one has to begin far from Switzerland, in the low green country along the southern edge of the Mendip Hills in Somerset, England. Strung between Bristol and the sea lie a chain of small towns and villages: Axbridge, Cheddar, Winscombe, Yatton, Rington, Congressbury, the kind of places where everyone belongs to something. A church choir, a Skittles League, a Mothers Club, a guild. In the early 1970s, the social calendars of these villages were anchored by exactly such institutions, among them the Axbridge Ladies Guild, an evening-out club for Axbridge women, a Cheddar Mothers group, and Skittles teams from Rington and Congressbury. For 2 years running, these overlapping circles of friends and neighbors had pooled their savings and organized a group excursion to the continent, a single glorious day abroad, squeezed between school runs and shift work, that members talked about for months afterward. For 1973, they settled on something more ambitious than ever before: a chartered flight, all their own, to the city of Basel, where France, Germany, and Switzerland meet on the banks of the Rhine. The plan was simple and irresistible. Fly out at dawn, spend the day shopping in Switzerland, chocolate, watches, gifts for the children, and be home in Somerset by bedtime. A day trip on that scale required a whole airplane, and to get one at a price a village guild could afford, the organizers turned to the charter market. The aircraft they hired seated 139 passengers, and the clubs were determined to fill every seat, opening the passenger list to husbands, sisters, friends, and a handful of children once the members themselves had signed up, in homes across the Cheddar Valley. The evening of the 9th of April was spent laying out coats and counting francs. Most of the travelers had never flown before. For many of the villages involved, it is not an exaggeration to say that a substantial share of an entire generation of young mothers boarded the same airplane the following morning. They were, by every account, in high spirits. It was the sort of trip that exists in 1,000 family photo albums across Britain. The coach to the airport in the half-dark, the thermos flasks, the borrowed suitcases for a journey that needed none. Nobody packed for snow. It was the middle of April. The company entrusted with this cargo of ordinary happiness was Invicta International Airways, a small British independent founded in 1964 and based at Manston Airport in Kent, on the far southeastern tip of England. Invicta was a creature of its era. Post-war Britain had produced dozens of small carriers that lived in the spaces the state airlines left behind: troop charters, inclusive tour holiday flights, air freight, and the kind of one-off group hire that a Somerset ladies' guild might request. It was a hard business with thin margins, and it ran on second-hand equipment. Airplanes bought cheaply after larger, richer airlines had finished with them. By 1973, the backbone of Invicta's passenger fleet was one of the most unloved airliners of its generation, the Vickers Vanguard. Conceived in the mid-1950s as a successor to the wildly successful Viscount, the Vanguard was a huge, deep-bellied, four-engine turboprop, its double-lobed fuselage giving it a distinctive pot-bellied profile and a cavernous hold beneath the cabin floor. Its four Rolls-Royce Tyne engines made it fast for a propeller aircraft and astonishingly economical per seat. On paper, it was exactly what short-haul aviation needed. The problem was timing. The Vanguard entered service in 1961, at almost the precise moment the traveling public fell permanently in love with jets. Airlines that might have ordered turboprops by the dozen instead stretched their budgets for Boeing 727s and Tridents, and passengers, given the choice, followed the jet engines. Just 44 Vanguards were ever built, for only two launch customers, British European Airways and Trans-Canada Airlines, and by the late 1960s both were already shedding them. That was where operators like Invicta came in. Second-hand Vanguards were cheap, roomy, and rugged, ideal for the inclusive tour trade, and Invicta picked up several examples from the Canadian fleet. One of them was a Vanguard 952 registered g-axop, Oscar Papa over the radio, built in 1961 and now 12 years old. By the standards of the charter world, it was a perfectly respectable machine, well-maintained, fitted with the standard navigation suite of its day, and flown by a two-pilot crew. It carried a flight data recorder, which would later prove crucial. It did not carry a cockpit voice recorder, because British regulations in 1973 did not yet require one on an aircraft of its vintage, a gap in the rules that would leave investigators and history permanently deaf to whatever was said on its flight deck during the last 20 minutes of its existence. On the evening of the 9th of April, Oscar Papa stood on the ramp at Luton, scheduled for an early positioning flight to Bristol, where 139 passengers would be waiting. The two men who climbed aboard g-axop before dawn on the 10th of April both wore four stripes. Flying with two captains was common at small charter airlines, where scheduling was a permanent improvisation, and the arrangement came with an informal custom. The pilots swapped roles leg by leg. Captain Ivor Terry, the senior of the pair, flew the short positioning hop from Luton to Bristol. That meant that the leg to Basel, the leg with the passengers, the leg into the weather, belonged to Captain Anthony Dorman. Terry, 47 years old, was a product of the Royal Air Force, where he had begun training in October 1944 and served as a military pilot from 1947, flying Lancasters, Shackletons, Varsities, and Valettas before moving to civil aviation. He had been a captain since 1968, first on the Douglas DC-4 and then from 1971 on the Vanguard. His logbook showed 9,172 flying hours, more than 300 of them on type, and he knew Basel well. 61 landings there, 14 of them flown on instruments. Nothing in his record attracted the slightest criticism, then or later. Anthony Noel Dorman was another matter entirely. A Canadian, born in 1938, Dorman had begun his flying career with the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1963, and lost it almost immediately when the service discontinued his training, recording that he had shown insufficient aptitude for flying. Most men would have taken the hint. Dorman did not. Over the following years, he clawed his way up through civil licenses instead. A private license, then a commercial license, then a senior commercial license, and eventually a Nigerian license as well, issued on the strength of an instrument rating test that investigators would later note was never actually entered in his logbook. When Dorman moved to Britain and set his sights on an airline career, The pattern continued with almost unbelievable persistence. He attempted the United Kingdom instrument rating, the qualification that certifies a pilot to fly in cloud. By reference to instruments alone, at least 9 times, failing again and again as examiners cited inadequate flying and/or theoretical knowledge. Before finally passing in January 1971, the instrument rating is not an exotic credential. It is the foundational skill of all commercial aviation, the ability on which every approach in bad weather ultimately rests. Dorman needed the better part of a decade, 2 continents, and 9 attempts to acquire it. His type rating test told the same story. He qualified on the DC-3, the DC-4, and eventually the Vanguard, but only after failing the flight test at least once on each aircraft. None of this prevented him from being hired. Armed at last with a British license, Dorman joined Invicta, flew his first year as a DC-4 co-pilot, transitioned to the Vanguard, and in October 1972, some 18 months after scraping through his instrument rating on the 9th attempt, was promoted to captain. His paperwork claimed a total of 1,205 flying hours, nearly 100 of them on the Vanguard, but the investigators who later combed through his logbook found it so riddled with discrepancies that they concluded his true experience could not be established at all. What could be established was this: he had landed at Basel 33 times, 9 of them on instrument approaches, and he had shared a cockpit with Ivor Terry on 17 previous occasions. It would be easy, too easy, to read Dorman's file as the record of a fraud. It reads at least as plausibly as the record of a man who wanted nothing in the world so much as to fly, and who kept hurling himself at every barrier the system placed in front of him until, one by one, the barriers gave way. The tragedy of Anthony Dorman is not that he cheated the system. It is that the system, tested 9 separate times, eventually said yes. On the morning of the 10th of April, that system put him in the left seat of a fully loaded airliner, pointed at a snowstorm. To understand what happened to Flight 435, one must first understand how pilots of that era found a runway they could not see, because in 1973, at an airport like Basel, the answer relied on technology that predated the Second World War. The workhorse of the system was the non-directional beacon, or NDB. Nothing more than a medium-wave radio transmitter planted in the ground, broadcasting in all directions at once, on frequencies neighboring the AM band used by ordinary broadcast stations. On board the aircraft, a companion instrument called the Automatic Direction Finder, or ADF, listened for the beacon signal and swung a needle to point at wherever the transmission seemed to be coming from. Fly toward the needle, and in principle, you fly toward the beacon. Chain several beacons together, and you can trace an entire arrival path through cloud without ever glimpsing the ground. The trouble is contained in the word seemed. An ADF needle does not point at a beacon. It points at radio energy, wherever that energy happens to originate. Medium-wave signals bend around terrain, reflect off weather fronts, and skip off the ionosphere. Thunderstorms yank ADF needles toward lightning, and precipitation, rain, and above all dry, blowing snow, brushes against the airframe and charges it with static electricity, filling the receiver with noise that can mask a genuine beacon or conjure a phantom one. Every pilot of the era knew the folklore. In heavy precipitation, an ADF needle is a witness of doubtful character, to be cross-examined constantly against every other source of information on the flight deck. Basel made that cross-examination harder than it should have been. The airport's approach to runway 16 was built around 2 NDB SPA, BN, the main approach beacon sitting on the extended runway centerline north of the field, and MN, a second beacon nearby. The published procedure called for an arriving aircraft to cross BN, fly a long left-hand racetrack out via MN, and come back around to BN from the north, now pointed straight down the axis of runway 16, at which point the crew would intercept the Instrument Landing System, the ILS, whose localizer beam marked the extended centerline and whose glide slope beam defined the correct descent path to the touchdown zone. With BN tuned on one of the aircraft's 2 ADF receivers and MN on the other, the loop was meant to be simple: 2 needles, 2 beacons, 1 runway. But the beacons around Basel had a flaw. Their transmissions deviated from the standards laid down by the International Civil Aviation Organization. They broadcast an unmodulated carrier wave, which made positively identifying each station, normally done by listening for its Morse code call sign, significantly more difficult than it was supposed to be. The Swiss investigation would later note, remarkably, that the beacons gave some degree of difficulty to every single crew that approached Basel that morning. Flight 435's equipment added a further layer of fragility. The ADF receiver on Captain Dorman's side of the cockpit suffered from intermittent electrical interruptions, causing its indications to drop out and recover unpredictably. The set was usable, but only with suspicion, only with constant cross-checking against static-free aids or against radar guidance from the ground. On the 10th of April 1973, over Basel, the static-free aids were few, the radar guidance was not offered, and the sky was full of snow. At 7:19 that morning, Flight 435 lifted off from Bristol's Lulsgate Airport and turned southeast, its cabin loud with the particular joy of 139 people for whom flying itself was still an event. The 4 Tyne engines settled into their cruise drone. The stewardesses, there were 4 of them, began working their way down the aisle. Ahead lay the English Channel, France, and roughly an hour and a half of utterly routine flying. All times that follow are UT. Clocks on the ground in Switzerland read 1 hour later. The destination forecast was the only shadow on the morning. April snow is not rare in the high Alps, but Basel sits in the low, mild corridor of the Rhine Valley, and the storm that had settled over the region was a genuinely wintry one. Heavy, persistent snowfall, cloud bases forecast around 120 meters, barely 400 feet, and visibility sinking at times towards 700 meters. The crew had been briefed on all of it before departure. For an ILS approach flown properly, such weather was demanding but legal, the kind of morning that fills a cockpit with quiet concentration rather than alarm. The en route portion of the flight gave no hint of trouble. Navigation to the Basel terminal area was, by every reconstruction, entirely normal. Somewhere over eastern France, the Vanguard began its descent, slipping down into the cloud tops, and the world outside the windows went white and stayed that way. In the cabin, women who had watched the channel glitter beneath them an hour earlier now saw nothing at all. It was around 8:55 when Oscar Papa arrived in the skies over Basel, and the crew prepared to fly the racetrack pattern onto the ILS for runway 16. They would spend the next 18 minutes lost, without ever once believing that they were. The confusion began almost immediately. Even during the first procedure turn over the approach beacon BN, something in the needles refused to make sense, and the crew abandoned the turn and flew it a second time. Precisely what each pilot saw on his instruments in those minutes can never be known. The absence of a cockpit voice recorder sealed that conversation away forever. But the flight data recorder traced the result. Instead of one clean racetrack loop, Oscar Papa began carving a tangled sequence of turns through the snow, a pattern that, when investigators later plotted it over a map, looked less like an instrument approach than like handwriting from a shaking hand. Out of this tangle, the crew eventually rolled onto what they believed was the final approach, and began descending toward what they believed was runway 16. Neither belief was correct. The descent carried them down through the overcast, not toward the flat, lit expanse of the airport, but toward the suburbs and rising fields south and east of the city, and they kept descending. Passengers, peering through the whirling snow, caught fragmentary glimpses of the ground. Rooftops, houses, startlingly close. How close became a matter of record at 9:08, when the telephone rang in the Basel control tower. On the line was a meteorologist at the Binningen Observatory, on the heights about 8 kilometers southeast of the airport, a man who happened to be a former aircraft commander, and who therefore understood exactly what he had just witnessed. Roughly 2 minutes earlier, he reported, a large 4-engine airliner had swept over the observatory at a height he estimated at 50 meters, 160 feet, heading south, away from the airport, in heavy snow. He urged the controllers to get the aircraft climbing immediately, 50 meters, over ground that was itself well above airport elevation. In visibility of a few hundred meters, the Vanguard had passed within a few seconds of striking the hills on its very first attempt. Somewhere in those moments, the crew, too, evidently sensed that the picture was wrong. The approach was broken off and the aircraft climbed away. The Swiss report would later describe this first approach, with clinical understatement, as a near accident far from the aerodrome. It was also a warning, the clearest imaginable, that the aircraft's navigation picture and the actual world had come completely apart. A crew with full confidence in that warning might have climbed to a safe altitude, taken stock, and asked the ground for every scrap of help available. Instead, Flight 435 went around and tried again, and at some point in the sequence that followed, the flying duties changed hands. Captain Terry, the veteran, took over from Dorman. It is a moment that should have marked the flight's salvation, 9,000 hours of experience, replacing the least qualified captain in the company. But Terry could only fly the picture his instruments painted for him, and the picture was already false. The senior captain took control of an aircraft that no one on board knew the position of, and flew it, with smooth professional competence, toward a runway that was not there. What the crew intended as they came around for the second attempt was to rejoin the pattern, cross MN, proceed to BN, and re-intercept the ILS. What they actually did, the flight data recorder later showed, was conduct the entire second approach south of the airport, on the wrong side of the field altogether, over the forested ramparts of the Jura foothills, without ever crossing the ILS marker beacons that would have confirmed their position along the true approach path. The needles, wandering in the static, told them a story. The story happened to be internally consistent, and both pilots, primed by the pattern they expected to see, believed it. While the meteorologist from Binningen was still on the telephone, the crew's voice came over the tower frequency, calm and procedural. They reported passing the first beacon, MN. The controller acknowledged and told them to report BN, the final approach fix. A few minutes later, they did exactly that. At 9:11, a second telephone rang in the Basel tower. This time it was Zurich Area Control Center, whose long-range radar had picked up something that made no sense. An unidentified aircraft a few miles south of Basel, tracking away from the airport, crawling toward the high ground at Hochwald. Did Basel have any traffic out there? The Basel controller's first instinct was that it could not be his inbound flight had just reported BN, north of the field, established inbound. Yet even as he spoke, he glanced at his own radar display, largely unwatched until that moment, and saw it. An echo, south of the airport, moving south. What followed was a conversation conducted simultaneously on two channels, and it reads today like a nightmare transcribed. On the telephone, Zurich pressed its warning. The echo was heading for Hochwald. On the radio, the tower, still not convinced the echo and the airliner were the same object, transmitted a landing clearance to Flight 435, adding the surface wind from 320 at 8 knots and asking the crew to call the approach lights in sight. From the Vanguard came a single courteous word of thanks. Then, prompted by the growing wrongness of it all, the controller keyed his microphone again and asked Flight 435 whether they were quite certain they had passed BN. The reply was unhurried and devastating in retrospect. There had been a spurious indication, the crew acknowledged, but they were now joining the localizer. Moments later, they confirmed that they were established on both the localizer and the glide slope, a report of textbook precision, describing an approach that existed only inside their instruments. The controller told them plainly that he could not see them where they said they were, and then, as the echo on his screen crept further into the hills, transmitted his final warning. "You are on the south of the airfield." There was no reply. There would never be a reply. Every subsequent call to Flight 435 fell into silence. South of the city, beneath the overcast, the ground was rising faster than the airplane. The Vanguard, configured for landing, was descending on what its pilots took to be the glide slope, through cloud and driving snow, over terrain that climbed toward wooded ridgelines several hundred meters higher than the airport they believed lay ahead. In the last seconds, a glimpse of trees through the snow, an altimeter reading that finally refused to be rationalized, told the crew the truth, and they threw the aircraft into a climb. The flight data recorder captured the desperate, too-late transition. Power coming up, the nose rising, the still airworthy airliner straining to outclimb the hillside. At 9:13, with its nose high and its wings still flying, g-axop brushed the treetops on the ridge above the hamlet of Herrenmatt, in the parish of Hochwald in the canton of Zurich, 16 kilometers south of Basel-Mulhouse Airport, flying away from the runway on which it had just been cleared to land. The initial contact was almost gentle, a shudder as the propellers and belly tore through the crowns of the beech and fir. Then the trees thickened, the ridge rose to meet the fuselage, and gentleness ended. The Vanguard pitched over, struck the slope, and cartwheeled, shedding wings, engines, and great sections of cabin as it tore a gash through the forest. The forward fuselage disintegrated. The tail broke free and came to rest inverted among the trees, its severed cross-section open to the falling snow. In the tower at Basel, the controller was still calling. On the radar screen, the echo south of the airfield had stopped. The ridge above Herrenmatt is quiet country, a scatter of farmhouses, pasture, and steep beechwood, the kind of place where the loudest event of a normal April morning is a tractor. The people who lived there heard the Vanguard before they saw anything. 4 turboprops at high power, impossibly low, followed by a tearing, rolling concussion that shook snow from the trees. Farmers and villagers from Hochwald were the first rescuers, wading uphill through knee-deep snow toward a column of smoke, into a forest suddenly strewn with luggage, seats, torn aluminum, and the dead. What they found at the top defied the scale of anything a village could prepare for. The forward 2/3 of the airplane had been destroyed outright, its occupants killed in the initial impacts as the aircraft tumbled. But the tail had broken away comparatively early in the sequence, and inside and around it, in the churned snow, there were survivors, dozens of them, many grievously injured, some walking dazed among the trees in clothes, chosen for a day of shopping. Of the 145 people who had boarded at Bristol, 37 were still alive. 35 passengers and one of the 4 stewardesses injured, and one stewardess, almost beyond belief, physically unhurt. Both pilots and 104 passengers were dead or dying. It remains the worst toll of any accident involving the Vickers Vanguard, and the worst of any air disaster on Swiss soil, before or since. The survivors' ordeal was not over. The crash site sat high on a snowbound ridge, far from any road that a heavy vehicle could use, and the same storm that had blinded the airplane now slowed every rescuer climbing toward it. Villagers improvised stretchers and carried the injured down through the forest. Helicopters clattered in and out of the murk as the weather allowed. Survivors later described waiting in the wreckage of the tail as the snow fell on them. The injured and the unhurt pressed together for warmth, and, in one of the most quietly devastating details of the whole disaster, singing. They were church women from the Mendips, and while they waited to learn whether they would live, they sang hymns into the falling snow. The news reached Somerset by early afternoon, and it fell on the villages like a physical blow. This had not been a random cross-section of the traveling public. It had been the heart of a community, concentrated by friendship onto a single airplane. Axbridge, a town of barely 1,000 people, lost neighbors from nearly every street. Cheddar, Winscombe, Congresbury, Rington, and Yatton counted their dead in the dozens between them. 55 children lost their mothers that morning. There were schools in the Cheddar Valley, where the following day's classrooms held child after child newly motherless, comforted by teachers who had themselves lost friends. Then came the part that no one who lived through it ever forgot, the journey to Basel to identify the dead. Husbands, fathers, and grown children flew out, many of them boarding an airplane for the first time in their lives, to collect what an airplane had taken from them. In a hall in Switzerland, the coffins were laid out in long rows, and contemporary reporters, hardened men of the Fleet Street disaster beat, wrote that their composure failed them there, at the sight of a teenage boy weeping on the steps outside, at husbands moving along the rows carrying bags of their wives' spare clothes in hopes of making a match, at families searching for any small certainty to take home. The British press named the event simply the Ball air crash, and for a generation in Somerset, no further description was necessary. The investigation fell to the Swiss Federal Accident Commission, working with British counterparts from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, whose government would later republish the findings in full as Aircraft Accident Report 1175. The investigators had one priceless asset and one crippling absence. The asset was the flight data recorder, which had survived and which allowed the aircraft's actual path to be reconstructed in detail. The absence was any record of the pilots' voices. No cockpit voice recorder had been fitted, and none had been required, meaning that the single most important question, what the two captains believed they were seeing, could only ever be answered by inference. The flight path told its own astonishing story. Plotted on a chart, the Vanguard's final 18 minutes formed a drunken scrawl of loops and reversals sprawled almost entirely across the terrain south of the airport. the opposite side from the published approach pattern. The aircraft had flown its supposed beacon passages, procedure turns, and final approaches over ground, where no beacon and no approach existed. When the crew reported crossing MN, they were not at MN. When they reported BN inbound, they were miles from BN, heading into the hills. Their final fatal descent tracked no radio aid at all that investigators could firmly identify. It passed through none of the ILS marker beacons, and yet the crew had reported themselves established on the localizer and glide slope in tones of complete assurance. How could two pilots, one of them among the most experienced in the company, construct so total an illusion? The commission assembled the answer from layers. The foundation was the beacons themselves. BN and MN did not comply with international standards, transmitting unmodulated carriers that made positive identification genuinely difficult, and the investigation established that every crew approaching Basel that morning had trouble with them to some degree. On top of that lay the weather, heavy snow generating precipitation static that degraded medium wave reception across the board, and the specific defect in Dorman's ADF receiver, whose intermittent electrical interruptions made its needle drop out and swing unpredictably. The indications were usable, the commission concluded, but not trustworthy. Safe only if relentlessly cross-checked against static-free aids or radar. That cross-checking discipline was precisely what the crew of Flight 435 failed to apply. Fragments of expected indications were accepted as confirmations. Contradictions were explained away, as when a challenged beacon passage became merely a spurious indication. And each pilot's mental map, once wrong, bent every new needle swing into agreement with itself. Nor had the ground done what the ground could have. The automatic equipment at Basel recorded that visibility on the instrument runway had at times fallen below the minimum values legally required for the aircraft's approach, and those values were never communicated to the crew. The tower's radar display, on which the aircraft's impossible position was visible, went effectively unwatched until a controller in Zurich, 60 kilometers away, telephoned to ask why an unidentified echo was crawling toward Hochwald. And when the Basel controller did finally grasp that something was wrong, his questions and warnings arrived as suggestions against the crew's certainty in the final 90 seconds of the flight, when only an immediate commanding climb instruction could have changed anything. The commission's verdict was direct. The crew lost their orientation during 2 instrument approaches flown in instrument conditions, and the second overshoot was begun too late to clear the terrain. The aircraft itself, they emphasized, was airworthy to the last second, the engines running, the controls answering. Nothing failed on g-axop that morning except the picture inside its pilots' heads, and the systems, human and institutional, that were supposed to correct it, which returns the story, unavoidably, to Anthony Dorman, because the most uncomfortable finding of the whole investigation was not on the mountain, but in the filing cabinets of the licensing authorities. Here was a man washed out of military flight training for lack of aptitude, a man whose foreign instrument qualification rested on a test no one could find in his logbook, a man who had failed the British instrument rating 8 times before passing on the 9th, a man who needed multiple attempts at every type rating he ever held, a man whose logbook was so inconsistent that his real experience was unknowable, and the system had at every stage ultimately handed him the next certificate. Each individual examiner had followed the rules. The rules simply contained no mechanism by which 9 failures could mean no. The commission was careful and fair in apportioning what followed. Dorman flew the approaches into confusion, but it was not Dorman alone at the end. Ivor Terry, blameless in record and reputation, took control for the final approach and flew it into the ridge, because by then the false picture had captured him too. And here the investigation put its finger on something aviation would spend the next 2 decades learning to name. Terry, the report observed, had almost no experience of being a co-pilot. He was a senior captain by instinct and habit, and in the right seat he had acted and thought like one, a second commander rather than a monitor, cross-checker and challenger. 2 captains had produced, between them, less mutual protection than 1 captain and 1 skeptical first officer. The crash predated the vocabulary of crew resource management by nearly a decade, but Flight 435 sits squarely among the accidents that made that vocabulary necessary. There remained and remains a dissenting school of thought. Years later, Jan Bartelski, a former KLM captain and accident analyst, argued that the crew of Flight 435 may have been genuinely deceived, led astray by phantom transmissions, spurious radio signals masquerading as the Basel beacons, and that the official finding leaned too heavily on the failings of men who could no longer answer. The theory has never been proven, and the investigation's reply is embedded in its own logic. The entire discipline of instrument flying exists because needles sometimes lie, and the procedures the crew skipped, the marker beacons never crossed, the cross-checks never made, the warning from the tower never heeded, were the very procedures designed to catch a lying needle. Whether the deception began in the atmosphere, in a faulty receiver, or in the human mind, the last line of defense was always going to be the crew. On the 10th of April 1973, that line did not hold. The disaster forced changes on both sides of the channel. In Britain, the exposure of Dorman's training history, splashed across newspapers that could scarcely believe what they were printing, led to a tightening of licensing and testing standards, closing the door on the idea that persistence alone could eventually wear down an examination system. The broader lessons pushed in directions the industry was already too slowly traveling. Cockpit voice recorders spreading through the transport fleet, radar monitoring of approaches becoming the norm rather than the exception, and the retirement, year by year, of approach procedures built on the elderly, credulous needle of the ADF. Basel itself would in time be served by the modern precision aids its geography had always demanded. In Somerset, the changes were quieter and permanent. In half a dozen churchyards along the Mendips, there are rows of headstones that share a single date, and for 50 years the villages have kept faith with it. Survivors and bereaved families made pilgrimages back to the ridge at Hochwald, where the local community, many of whose members had carried the injured down through the snow, raised a memorial at the site. On the 50th anniversary, in 2023, Congressbury dedicated a garden of 20 rose bushes, one for each of its dead, paid for by public subscription. Axbridge unveiled a brass plaque in the Church of St. John the Baptist. Cheddar planted an oak, and in 2024, 51 years after the crash, the official list of the dead was quietly amended to add a name that had been missed for half a century. Jane Surridge of Bristol, 9 years old, identified at last through burial records by a former classmate who had never stopped wondering why her friend's name was not on the list. The forest on the ridge above Herrenmat grew back long ago. The scar the Vanguard tore through the beaches has closed. The way forests close over everything. And in April, the snow up there rarely lasts the morning. What has not closed is the arithmetic of that day, which the Mendip villages still carry. The choir's a few voices short for a generation, the guild that never met again in the same numbers, the 55 children who grew up explaining, whenever the question arose, that their mothers had gone to Switzerland for a single day of freedom and never come home. They boarded in the dark, laughing, with empty suitcases for the things they meant to bring back. Somewhere over the Rhine Valley the world turned white, two needles began to lie, and every safeguard built by two countries' aviation systems failed, one after another, in the space of 18 minutes. The last of those safeguards was a voice on the radio, telling the crew the one true thing anyone had told them all morning, that they were south of the airfield, 30 seconds before the trees.